I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless chatter and demands that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I needed the forest, the silence, the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but my own thoughts and the natural world around me. I packed my backpack carefully, making sure I had all the essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag, extra layers of clothing, a stove, food for 3 days, plenty of water, a flashlight, spare batteries, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and a small knife. I double-checked everything before leaving my apartment, telling myself I was prepared for anything. The drive to the campsite was longer than I expected. I followed a narrow, winding road that cut through dense forest, the trees growing closer and taller as I moved further from civilization. Eventually, the road narrowed to a dirt track, and I had to drive slowly to avoid hitting rocks and tree roots. When I finally parked near a clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was already low, sending long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath, feeling that strange mixture of relief and nervous excitement that always came when I left the city behind. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots, and I had to choose a spot that was both flat enough to sleep comfortably and somewhat sheltered from the wind. I finally found a spot near a cluster of trees that offered some protection and a small rise in the ground that would help with drainage in case of rain. As I hammered in the tent stakes, I kept my eyes on the darkening treeline, noticing how quickly the forest seemed to change as the sun sank lower. The shadows deepened, the shapes of the trees becoming twisted and alien in the fading light. I told myself I was imagining it, that the forest was just playing tricks on my eyes. Once the tent was up, I unpacked my supplies and prepared a small meal. The process of cooking over a portable stove was comforting, almost meditative. I chopped vegetables and heated some water for instant noodles, listening to the quiet noises of the forest. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. Everything felt peaceful, almost serene. I ate slowly, savoring the calm, telling myself that this was exactly what I had come for. After the meal, I cleaned up and organized my campsite. I placed all food in a secure container and hung it from a tree branch, as I had been taught to do, to prevent attracting wildlife. The sun had almost completely set, leaving only a dim twilight. I lit my flashlight and explored the area around my tent, making sure I knew the boundaries of the clearing and any potential hazards like rocks, steep drops, or thick underbrush. I felt a thrill of excitement at the idea of spending the night alone in the forest. It was exactly what I had wanted. Night fell completely, and with it came a deep, enveloping darkness that made the forest feel entirely different. The shadows were deeper, more menacing, and every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping somewhere in the distance made me flinch, even though I told myself it was probably just an animal. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest, trying to focus on the rhythmic sound of my own breathing to calm my mind. I had planned to sleep early, knowing I would wake with the sunrise, but something about the night made it difficult. Every small sound seemed sharper, every rustle of leaves more urgent, more deliberate. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. At first, it was soft, like the crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush, but then it came again, closer this time. I froze, straining my ears. The sound didn't match any animal I knew of. It was heavier, more deliberate. My heart began to race. I reminded myself I was alone, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. Something was moving through the forest, watching, waiting. I told myself it was probably a deer or a wild boar, anything to rationalize the fear, but the sound continued, slow and steady, moving around the clearing in a way that made me feel surrounded. I got up cautiously, keeping my flashlight low so I wouldn't draw attention. I scanned the area, focusing on every movement, every shadow. The trees cast long, strange shapes, and the underbrush seemed to ripple with movement, but I saw nothing. I tried to convince myself that my imagination was exaggerating, that the forest had always seemed scarier at night, but the sound persisted, moving closer. My pulse pounded in my ears, my hands shaking slightly. Then I saw it. Not a full figure, not clearly defined, but a shape moving along the edge of the clearing. It was large, humanoid in form, hunched slightly, and moving with a quiet, deliberate pace. I felt a wave of panic, the kind that makes you feel your blood freeze. I remembered every warning I had ever read about camping alone in the wilderness. The shape seemed aware of me, pausing at times to listen, then moving again. I backed slowly toward my tent, trying to remain as silent as possible, my mind racing. I remembered the knife in my backpack. I grabbed it quickly, holding it tightly, and moved to the front of the tent where I had positioned my flashlight. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself I could survive this if I stayed calm and rational. The shape stopped for a moment, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, and I could see the faint outline of something large, muscular, and deliberate in its movements. It was impossible to tell if it was human, though the shape suggested that it might be. The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows and listening for any movement. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, and hardly dared to breathe. Every sound was amplified. A twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, to wait for daylight when the forest would be less threatening and visibility higher. I tried to stay focused, keeping my mind occupied by checking my supplies, adjusting my tent, and making sure everything was in order. Just before dawn, I saw the shape move again, retreating into the darkness of the forest. I didn't chase it, didn't try to follow. I waited until the first light of morning began to filter through the trees, washing the forest in a pale, gray light. I packed my things quickly, keeping my movements deliberate and careful, and decided to leave immediately. My legs were stiff from staying in one position all night, my body tense, but I kept moving, following the path back to my car. Every rustle of leaves, every branch snapping, made me jump, but I reminded myself to keep going, to not look back. By the time I reached the car, the sun was rising, and the forest no longer seemed menacing. The trees were familiar, the shadows less threatening, and the rustling of wildlife seemed natural again. I locked the doors of the car and took a few minutes to calm myself, drinking water and trying to steady my breathing. I thought about the night, about the shape I had seen, about how alone and vulnerable I had felt. But I also realized I had survived, that my careful preparation, my awareness, and my ability to stay calm had kept me safe. I drove away slowly, glancing at the forest through the windshield. It looked peaceful now, almost serene, but I knew what I had experienced was real. I told myself that it had been someone else, a hiker or a camper passing by, someone who had been lost or curious, but I also knew it could have been something else. I didn't need to know for certain. What mattered was that I had made it through the night alive, and that knowledge gave me a strange, almost exhausted sense of relief and accomplishment. By the time I reached the main road, I could finally breathe normally again. I stopped at a small diner for breakfast, eating slowly and staring out the window at the world that seemed so ordinary, so predictable after the intense, unpredictable night in the forest. I reflected on what had happened, on the fear and the adrenaline, on how vulnerable and alert I had felt, and on the lessons I had learned about preparation, observation, and trusting my instincts. I knew I would return to the forest one day, but never without the knowledge that the wilderness is not always safe, that there are moments when nature can feel threatening and the line between safety and danger is fragile. That night, back in my apartment, I unpacked my gear carefully, checking for damage and making notes for the next trip. I slept soundly, but the memory of the night lingered, a quiet tension that reminded me that the world is full of things beyond our understanding and control. I realized that fear is not always about monsters or the supernatural. Sometimes, it is about the unknown, the unseen, and the awareness that at any moment, something can challenge your sense of safety. The forest had tested me, had forced me to confront my fears, and I had survived. The experience left me changed, more cautious, more aware, and strangely, more alive. I knew that part of the thrill of camping was this confrontation with the raw, unpredictable world, and I understood now that respect for it and preparation for it were essential. I would return one day, but with a deeper understanding and a heightened sense of vigilance, knowing that survival sometimes depends as much on the mind as it does on skill or equipment. I had been planning the trip for months, reading maps, checking weather reports, and making lists of everything I would need. I wanted to go deep into the forest, far from roads, far from people, somewhere I could feel completely alone. It was early September when I finally packed my gear and drove to the trailhead. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the air was crisp and still, carrying that wet smell of early autumn leaves. I parked the car and checked my pack one last time. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water filters, fire starter, first aid kit, and my knife strapped to my belt. I felt ready, confident, maybe even a little too confident. The first few miles of the trail were easy, mostly flat with a few gentle inclines. The forest around me was dense, but the path was clear. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting moving patterns on the ground. I passed a small creek and stopped to drink, listening to the gentle sound of the water. Everything felt peaceful. I had done this before, but always closer to civilization. This time, I wanted to push myself further. By midday, the trail began to rise more steeply. My legs burned as I climbed, my backpack pulling me down with every step. I kept reminding myself that it was supposed to be hard, that this was why I had trained for it. I stopped at a ridge and looked out over the forest below. The trees stretched endlessly, green and orange with the first hints of fall. It was breathtaking. I took a deep breath, then forced myself to focus. I had to find a campsite before dark. I found a small clearing a few miles further in. It wasn't perfect, but it had flat ground and was far enough from the trail to feel private. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the hard, dry soil, and laid out my sleeping bag. I built a small fire ring with stones I found nearby. As I worked, I noticed how quiet it was. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and occasional bird calls. But as the day moved on, I began to notice other noises. Branches cracking somewhere deeper in the forest, leaves rustling with no wind, a faint, low sound like something moving slowly over the forest floor. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was deer, or raccoons, or maybe just my imagination. Night fell quickly. The forest changed as the sun went down. Shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped. I cooked a simple dinner over my fire, the smell of burnt rice and beans mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. I kept the fire small, just enough to see and stay warm. Sitting there, I realized how truly alone I was. There were no hikers, no cars in the distance, no lights anywhere. The only people I had seen that day had been at the trailhead, and they were now long gone. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and tried to sleep. I was tired, but I couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something moving outside. Soft thumps, leaves crunching underfoot, branches snapping. I told myself again it was probably animals, but the sound seemed deliberate, too slow, too cautious. My mind started imagining what could be out there. Bears? Coyotes? Someone else? I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. I had planned for this. I had a knife, a fire, a whistle. I could handle it. Hours passed in restless half-sleep. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A slow, deliberate step near the edge of my campsite, followed by another. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was moving carefully, deliberately, as if testing me, watching me. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The fire had burned low, just a few glowing embers. I could see shadows moving just beyond the tree line. I froze. Whatever it was staying just out of sight, circling, pausing, listening. I didn't sleep again that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to stay alert, imagining the worst, preparing for it. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see sunlight filtering through the trees. I cautiously left the tent, scanning the perimeter. The forest looked normal, but I noticed something unsettling. Footprints, too large to be mine, circled my campsite. They weren't animal tracks. Someone had been here, watching, maybe even waiting. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything back into my backpack. I decided to cut my trip short. I knew the trail back would be long, but I didn't care. I moved faster than I had on the way in, constantly glancing over my shoulder, listening for any sign that someone or something was following me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling never left me. As I descended, the forest became lighter, the sounds of birds and wind filling the space where fear had been. I kept my fire-starting materials in my hands, ready to drop everything and make a blaze if necessary. Hours passed, and finally, the trail opened onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me. I saw the car in the distance, parked exactly where I had left it. When I got inside and locked the doors, I sat for a long time, catching my breath and trying to calm down. I checked the forest from the car window, but it was empty, peaceful. I realized then how vulnerable I had been, how quickly the forest could turn from serene to threatening when another person or predator had unknown intentions. I drove home slowly, replaying everything in my head. I thought about what I had learned. Always trust your instincts, always be aware, and never underestimate how carefully someone could observe you without your knowledge. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted but relieved, alive, and more cautious than ever. In the days after, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, about the slow, careful movement I had heard that night. I never found out who or what had been watching me, but I knew one thing: I would never go that deep into the forest alone again. I realized that nature is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest things are not animals or storms. They are other humans, silently moving through the same space, their intentions unknown. From then on, every time I planned a camping trip, I made sure to check in with someone, to stay on marked trails, and to keep my instincts sharp. That trip taught me to respect the wilderness and the unknown presence of others. I didn't lose anything that night except a sense of safety, but I gained a new awareness, a vigilance that would protect me on every trip afterward. Even now, months later, I can't hear a crackling branch outside my window without remembering that night, remembering the fear, the isolation, and the relief of seeing sunlight break through the trees. It's a memory that stays with me, a reminder of how careful we must be in the wild, even when we think we are alone. I had planned this camping trip for months. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the endless traffic, the constant hum of electricity and screens. I needed to be alone with nothing but the forest and myself. I had chosen a remote spot several hours' drive from the nearest town, deep in a national forest that few people ever ventured into. I had done my research, packed carefully, and double-checked every piece of gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, first aid kit, headlamp, extra batteries, a hatchet, rope, compass, and detailed maps. I even printed out an emergency plan just in case. I thought I had covered everything. The drive to the trailhead was long but uneventful. The last few miles were gravel roads that jostled my car, lined by thick trees that seemed to lean over the road like they were watching me pass. By the time I parked, the sun was already low in the sky, burning orange streaks across the horizon. I unloaded my gear and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, slightly damp, and smelled of pine and earth. There was a calmness here that I hadn't felt in years. I started hiking in, following the map closely. The trail was narrow and rugged, twisting up through hills and dense forest. The forest floor was covered in pine needles, fallen leaves, and broken twigs that snapped underfoot. I kept my pace steady, careful not to exhaust myself, and took frequent breaks to drink water and check my surroundings. The silence was profound. I didn't hear birds, just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and my own breathing. As I hiked deeper, the light faded quickly. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the forest was dim and shadowy, with long, dark shapes stretching between the trees. I picked a flat area, away from dead trees that could fall, and set up my tent. I was meticulous, securing the stakes firmly and checking the rainfly twice. I organized my backpack so I could access essential items quickly. Then I made a small fire pit, cleared it of leaves and debris, and set up my stove for cooking. That first night, everything felt normal. I cooked a simple meal of beans and rice, ate slowly, and watched the firelight flicker against the trees. The forest around me seemed alive, but not threatening. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the wind. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving, a snap of a branch or a distant rustle, but I convinced myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, nothing more. I fell asleep exhausted but content. The second day was bright and clear. I decided to explore a nearby stream I had marked on the map. It was a steep hike, the ground loose and slippery in places, with roots snaking across the trail. I moved carefully, holding onto branches when necessary, feeling the strain in my legs and back from the heavy pack. The stream was beautiful, clear, cold water tumbling over rocks, small waterfalls forming tiny pools. I filled my water bottle and drank some, enjoying the sharp, refreshing taste. I noticed tracks along the banks. Deer, maybe a coyote, nothing alarming. I stayed for a while, taking pictures with my phone for memories, then headed back to camp in the late afternoon. It was on the second night that I started to feel uneasy. I had built my fire again, ate a light dinner, and settled into my sleeping bag. But just as I was drifting off, I heard something that made my stomach tighten. A branch snapping, followed by a low, deliberate crunching sound coming from outside the tent. I froze, listening. The noise continued, slow and measured, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the tent mesh, but saw nothing. The sound stopped. My heart was racing. I reminded myself it could be a deer or a bear, but I had done everything to minimize attention. Food stored away in a bear canister, tent set up far from trails, fire burning brightly. Still, the sense of being watched stayed with me. I spent the rest of the night half asleep, half alert. Every sound, wind, falling leaves, animals moving, set my nerves on edge. I kept my knife within reach and kept checking my gear, reassured by the presence of my flashlight and extra batteries. Morning came eventually, and with sunlight, the forest seemed less threatening. But the unease lingered. On the third day, I decided to hike further than before, hoping activity would distract me from my growing anxiety. I packed extra water and snacks and left early, keeping a careful eye on the sun's position. The trail became less defined, almost overgrown, forcing me to push branches aside and navigate around fallen trees. Around midday, I realized I had lost the trail. I double-checked my compass and map, retracing my steps to find familiar landmarks. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the soft earth, not animal prints. Boots, large and heavy, pressed into the dirt. They were fresh and they led parallel to my intended path. My stomach sank. Someone else was out here, in a part of the forest that should have been empty. I knew there were hunters in the area, but this far from the road, I should have seen no one. The footprints were large and spaced far apart, like whoever it was moving fast, confident, maybe even tracking. I debated turning back, but I didn't want to panic and get lost. I kept walking, paying close attention to sounds. Occasionally, I heard breaking twigs or low murmurs carried by the wind, but I couldn't tell from which direction. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low. My fire was barely a pile of embers, and I quickly reignited it. My hands shook as I prepared dinner, glancing repeatedly into the trees. That night, the noises outside my tent returned, more persistent this time. Footsteps, snapping branches, low thuds against the ground. I stayed still, pretending to sleep, watching my flashlight and hatchet ready. The hours stretched endlessly. At one point, I heard something brush against the tent itself, a deliberate movement, as if someone was testing it. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out cautiously. The campsite showed no obvious signs of intrusion, except for footprints around the perimeter. Large, irregular, human. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to calm down. I ate quickly, packed up, and decided to leave, taking a slightly longer but more exposed route to the trailhead. I kept my senses alert, scanning constantly for movement. The hike out was tense. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me flinch. I tried to keep a steady pace, but exhaustion was setting in. About halfway, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. A figure, blurry and distant, standing perfectly still, watching me. I froze, unsure whether to run or stay calm. After a tense few seconds, the figure disappeared behind a tree. I moved cautiously but faster, my stomach twisting with dread. I didn't look back. By late afternoon, I reached the main trail and finally saw a glimpse of civilization. A dirt road and, in the distance, a parked car. Relief washed over me, but I remained alert. I noticed tire tracks leading off the road into the forest near where I had seen the figure. Whoever had been following me had likely had a vehicle nearby. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I drove slowly, checking mirrors and scanning the roadside as I left the forest behind. The sense of being watched didn't leave entirely, but the safety of the road, the signs, the distant houses, reassured me. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small gas station, locked the doors, and took several deep breaths. I explained briefly to the attendant why I looked so shaken. Vaguely, nothing detailed, and bought bottled water and snacks, trying to calm down. After that experience, I returned home the next day. I filed a report with the local ranger station, describing the footprints, the presence of someone following me, and the vehicle tracks. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area and investigate. I kept my camping gear packed for weeks, unwilling to return to the forest for a long time. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I stayed calm, alert, and cautious. I didn't panic or make sudden movements that could have drawn attention. I relied on my preparation. Maps, compass, flashlight, hatchet, first aid kit, and careful planning. Most importantly, I respected the forest and the risks it contained, understanding that wilderness isn't just about nature. It's about unpredictability, human presence, and chance. It took months before I could think about camping again without a knot of fear in my stomach. When I did, I started with small, familiar areas, always letting someone know my route and estimated return time. That trip changed the way I approach nature. I am no longer casual about my safety. I know the forest can be peaceful, breathtaking, and restorative, but it can also be unpredictable and dangerous, not just from animals or weather, but from other humans. I never saw the person who had been following me, and perhaps I never will, but their presence left an indelible mark. It taught me vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unknown. Most importantly, it reminded me that survival in the wild isn't just about skills or equipment. It's about awareness, calmness, and knowing when to retreat. I still think about that trip. The smell of pine needles, the sound of wind through the trees, the flickering firelight. They haunt me in a different way now. Not like a ghost story, but as a memory of how fragile safety can be, and how careful you must be when you venture into the unknown. I have returned to the forest since, but never alone, and never without detailed plans, emergency contacts, and backup supplies. Every hike, every camp is measured, deliberate, cautious. That trip taught me to respect nature, yes, but it also taught me to respect people I do not know, especially when there is no one else around. That lesson, learned in fear and tension, has stayed with me longer than the fear itself. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being completely by myself in the woods that felt peaceful, almost cleansing, even if a little uncomfortable at first. I had planned this trip for weeks, choosing a remote part of the national forest where few people ever went. The trails were less traveled, the streams were hidden, and I wanted to test myself, to see how I would handle being entirely alone for several days. My pack was heavy with the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a small stove, water, extra clothes, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a pocket knife. I had read everything I could about wilderness survival and thought I was ready. I wasn't prepared for what actually happened. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, spilling golden light over the trees. The parking area was empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I strapped my pack on, adjusted the straps to fit snugly, and began walking into the forest. The path was narrow and uneven, winding between old pines and thick underbrush. Birds called above me, and a soft wind rustled through the branches. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. I walked slowly, keeping my eyes on the trail, listening to the forest sounds, and occasionally pausing to take photographs. I wanted to remember this place. By midday, the trail had taken me deeper into the forest. The canopy thickened, blocking much of the sunlight, and the air felt cooler and damp. I reached a small clearing where a stream ran across the path. The water was crystal clear, trickling over smooth stones. I filled my water bottle, drank, and splashed some on my face to cool off. I knew I wanted to camp somewhere near a water source, but not too close to avoid insects and dampness. After following the stream for a little while, I spotted a small flat area just beyond a cluster of trees. It was perfect. Dry ground, enough room for my tent, and a view of the forest around me. I set up camp, pounding the tent stakes into the soil, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. By the time I was done, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I made myself a small meal on my stove, something simple, instant rice with a few vegetables I had packed. The smell of the food and the warmth of the fire were comforting. As I ate, I could hear the forest settle around me. Birds returned to their nests, small animals scurried through the underbrush, and somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. It felt completely normal, completely peaceful. That is, until I noticed a rustling sound coming from the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or a rabbit, but the noise was heavier, more deliberate, and it didn't sound like any animal I had seen before. I froze and listened. The sound stopped for a moment, then began again, moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other small animal, but my heart rate increased. I double-checked that my knife was within reach, and I quietly moved to the edge of my tent to peek outside. Shadows shifted among the trees, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something large moving, maybe a bear. I had brought bear spray, but the idea of confronting a bear alone in the forest was terrifying. I didn't make a sound. I waited, breath held, eyes scanning the shadows. Eventually, the noise stopped, and the forest went quiet again. I decided it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, and tried to calm myself. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I couldn't sleep for a long time, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Around midnight, a new noise woke me. It was a low, crunching sound, like someone walking over dry leaves, moving slowly toward my camp. My heart leapt into my throat. This wasn't an animal. Animals didn't walk like this. I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself it was a bear. But the rhythm of the steps didn't match a bear's movements. They were too calculated. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I knew that would reveal my position if someone was there. Instead, I quietly unzipped a small side pocket of my backpack where I had kept my knife. The steps came closer. I could see the faint outline of a figure moving just past the edge of my tent. A man. Someone was out here in the middle of the forest near my camp at night. Panic surged. I tried to remember everything I had read about survival in the wilderness. I needed to stay calm, to stay quiet. I lay flat in my sleeping bag, holding the knife tightly, and waited. The footsteps paused, then circled my tent, slow and deliberate. The crunching of leaves grew closer, then receded, as if the person was inspecting my camp, looking for something. I could hear them muttering, though I couldn't make out words. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the steps stopped completely, and I forced myself to stay still, too afraid to breathe loudly. At dawn, the forest began to brighten. I stayed inside my tent, listening. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peeked out. The clearing looked empty, peaceful again. I wanted to leave immediately, but I knew walking back the way I came could be dangerous if whoever had been here was still around. I needed a plan. I gathered my things quickly, keeping my knife in hand, and packed the tent. I drank some water and ate a small snack, trying to stay alert. Then I decided to move quietly along a different path, one that ran roughly parallel to the trail I had taken in, hoping to get back to the main road without retracing the exact route. As I walked, I kept my senses sharp. Every sound made me flinch. A branch snapping, a bird taking flight, a deer rustling through the underbrush. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After several hours of careful walking, I reached a fork in the trail. One path went deeper into the forest. The other seemed to lead toward a ridge I had noticed from the trailhead map. I chose the ridge, hoping it would provide a clear view of the area and maybe a way to spot anyone following me. As I climbed, the trees thinned, and I finally had a broader view of the forest below. That's when I saw a small figure moving along one of the lower trails. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been near my camp last night was still here, following me. I realized I couldn't confront this person. I wasn't prepared for that. I had to find a way to get back to civilization. I remembered seeing a ranger station marked on my map about 3 miles north of the trail I was on. I decided to head there, moving quickly but trying to remain quiet. The terrain was steep and uneven, and I had to scramble over rocks and fallen trees, my legs burning, my hands scraped and bleeding in some places. I kept scanning behind me, trying to see if the figure was still following, but the trees made it difficult to tell. I pushed forward, every step filled with fear and adrenaline. By midday, I reached a small creek. I knew from the map that if I followed it downstream, it would eventually lead to a service road near the ranger station. I crouched by the creek, filled my water bottle, and tried to eat something to keep my strength up. Then I began moving along the bank, careful not to make any noise. The creek twisted and turned, but I stayed focused. Around mid-afternoon, I heard the sound of a vehicle engine in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I ran along the creek bank until I reached a dirt road, and there it was. A park ranger's truck, parked near a small bridge. I waved frantically until the ranger noticed me and pulled over. I explained everything as best I could, though I was still shaking, still breathless. The ranger listened carefully, then got on the radio. Within minutes, another vehicle arrived, and they drove me back to the main ranger station. They searched the area where I had camped, but didn't find anyone. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't noticed the figure outside my tent made me shiver. They told me I had done the right thing, staying calm, staying hidden, and moving toward help rather than confronting the person. By the time I left the forest, the sun was setting. I had never felt so exhausted, so scared, and yet so relieved. I knew I had learned something important. No matter how prepared you think you are, being alone in the wilderness carries risks you cannot predict. But I also learned that staying calm, thinking clearly, and moving carefully can make the difference between safety and disaster. I promised myself I would never underestimate the forest again, and I would always be ready for the unexpected. In the end, I had survived. My tent and gear were gone, likely taken or destroyed by the intruder, but I had my life. And as I drove home, watching the trees fade into the distance, I felt an odd mix of fear and gratitude. Fear for what had happened, but gratitude for having made it out alive, for having stayed alert, for having trusted my instincts. That experience stayed with me for years. Every time I went camping afterward, I remembered the forest that night, the footsteps circling my tent, and the deep lesson it had taught me. Nature is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and survival depends not just on skill, but on caution, awareness, and the will to keep moving forward no matter how afraid you are. I had been planning the camping trip for months, careful to pick a spot far from the main trails, where there were few people and a lot of wilderness. I wanted solitude, the kind that demanded respect, the kind that made the air feel heavier and every sound sharper. I chose a forested area that was known for its beauty but also for its remoteness. Maps and satellite images made it seem manageable, and I told myself that if anything went wrong, I could always hike back to the main road. I had done solo hikes before, so I was confident. I packed everything I thought I might need: tent, sleeping bag, water, freeze-dried food, a first aid kit, extra clothing, a headlamp, matches, a multi-tool, a compass, and my phone. Even though there was no cell signal deep in the forest, I had it as a backup in case I stumbled upon a rare spot with reception. The hike to the campsite was longer than I expected. The trail was narrow, littered with fallen branches and rocks. The sun was high, burning through the gaps in the dense canopy, and the forest floor smelled earthy, damp, and alive. I stopped every so often to catch my breath, to drink water, and to take in my surroundings. The birds were loud in the morning, and somewhere above, a hawk circled silently. Small rustlings in the underbrush reminded me that I was not alone. I kept telling myself it was squirrels or rabbits. I had no reason to fear anything else. I finally found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was surrounded by tall pines, thick enough to shield the area from wind, and it had a flat surface for my tent. The soil was dry, and there was enough space to safely build a fire a few feet from the tent. I unpacked my gear carefully, laying out the sleeping bag, setting up the tent, and checking that my knife and headlamp were within reach. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a twig or the soft hum of insects. The sun started to dip behind the trees, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and pink. Felt serene, almost unreal. I decided to explore the immediate area before dark, collecting dry wood for the fire and scouting for a water source. There was a small stream a short walk away, shallow but clear, running over smooth rocks. I filled my bottle and took a careful sip, enjoying the cold freshness of the water. While walking back, I noticed subtle signs of wildlife: footprints in the mud, broken branches where something had pushed through, droppings that suggested deer or wild boar. I felt a mild thrill of fear but reminded myself it was normal. Animals were just animals. They didn't want me any more than I wanted them. By the time I returned to the campsite, the sky had darkened and the forest had transformed. Shadows stretched and twisted, and the sounds of the forest changed. Birds were quiet, replaced by the rustle of small creatures and the occasional call of nocturnal animals. I built a fire carefully, arranging the logs to keep a steady flame. The warmth was comforting, and the light created a small circle of safety around my tent. I cooked some food, the smell of it mixing with the pine and damp earth. I sat close to the fire, listening, alert to every sound, but telling myself it was just the forest settling into night. The first unsettling moment came subtly. It was a rustling sound, different from the normal forest noises. It wasn't random or far off. It was deliberate, consistent, moving around the edge of the clearing. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. My mind raced, thinking of what could be making that sound. A deer? Possibly. A bear? Less likely, but the thought sent a shiver down my spine. I reminded myself that if it was a wild animal, noise and light usually kept them at a distance. I picked up a large branch, resting it beside me while the fire crackled. The rustling continued, sometimes close, sometimes moving away, as if circling me. I realized I had made a small mistake. I hadn't hung my food in a tree, and the scent of it might have attracted something. The possibility of a wild animal, particularly a bear, became real. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to stay calm, rationalizing, telling myself it was probably a deer or some small mammal. But the sound persisted, heavier steps now, a pattern that didn't match small animals. I decided to stand up, keeping the fire between me and the sound, and shout, hoping to scare away whatever it was. The forest was silent in response, but the rustling stopped abruptly. That momentary silence made me tense even more. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the trees and bushes. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, yet the hairs on my neck stood on end. Night deepened, and I forced myself to retreat into my tent, leaving the fire burning. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, my knife within reach, and tried to focus on the small, controllable tasks. Checking my supplies, thinking about my plan in case of an emergency. I felt vulnerable, the kind of vulnerable that comes from being completely alone in a vast wilderness. Sleep didn't come easily, and every small sound, a snapping twig, a rustling leaf, the wind shifting branches, made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again. A heavy, deliberate step, not far from the tent, followed by silence. I stayed still, listening. I realized that whatever it was, it knew I was there. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. Then, there was a sniffing noise, low and soft, almost tentative, moving closer. I gripped my knife tightly, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, leaving me with just the weak glow of the embers. I debated whether to leave the tent or stay inside, hoping that light and fire would protect me. The next moment was pure fear. Something charged the edge of the firelight, a massive shape, moving with a force that made the ground vibrate under its steps. My mind registered the unmistakable outline of a bear, larger than I had ever seen, black fur glinting faintly in the firelight. Paused, sniffing, looking directly at me. I froze, knowing that sudden movement could provoke it. My training, my past experiences in the wilderness kicked in. I stayed absolutely still, controlled my breathing, and slowly reached for my whistle. Loud noise could sometimes scare a bear away. The bear sniffed closer, crushing some dry twigs under its massive paws. I realized my mistake in not hanging my food. The smell had drawn it directly to my campsite. I had to act fast. I reached for a log with one hand while keeping my knife ready, and with all the strength I had, I threw the log toward the edge of the firelight, aiming not to hit the bear, but to create a sudden distraction. The log hit a tree, snapping loudly, and the bear jumped back, startled. It roared, a deep, guttural sound that rattled my bones, and I could feel the vibration through the ground. I didn't wait. I grabbed another log, throwing it in a wide arc, and then yelled loudly, stomping my feet and waving my arms. The bear retreated slowly, watching, sniffing the air. I kept up the noise, throwing rocks and wood, making myself appear as large and threatening as possible. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the bear stopped advancing and melted back into the darkness. I kept yelling and throwing objects until I could no longer hear its steps. Only then did I slump against my tent, shaking, trying to process the encounter. My hands were bleeding from throwing logs, my heart was racing, and every nerve in my body screamed with adrenaline. I realized that staying in the same spot for the night was too dangerous. I decided to wait until dawn and then pack up. Sleep was impossible. I kept listening, alert to every sound, ready to act if the bear returned. The night dragged on endlessly. My flashlight batteries were low, and I rationed the light to short bursts, just to check the surroundings. I thought about everything I could have done differently: hanging food, choosing a campsite closer to a visible clearing, making more noise while cooking. Every detail played over and over in my mind. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I began to pack quickly but carefully. Every movement was deliberate. I didn't want to attract attention. The forest was quieter than the previous night, and I hoped the bear had moved on. I gathered my gear, keeping my knife in hand, and started the slow, careful hike back toward the main trail. Each step was measured. I avoided snapping twigs, stepping on dry leaves, anything that could make noise. My muscles ached from tension and from carrying the pack, but fear kept me moving steadily. It took hours to reach the trail, navigating over rocks, fallen logs, and through thick underbrush. I kept scanning constantly, expecting to see the bear again, but I saw only smaller wildlife, birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer in the distance. When I finally emerged onto the main trail, the relief was overwhelming. I could hear the hum of distant vehicles, a sign that civilization was near. I quickened my pace, jogging carefully where possible, until I reached the parking lot where my car was parked. Sitting inside my car, exhausted and covered in scratches and dirt, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in over 12 hours. I drove slowly out of the forest, constantly scanning the trees beside the road, unwilling to take any chances. When I reached the first gas station and filled up, I finally allowed myself to relax. I called a friend to tell them I was okay, knowing that I had survived a close encounter that could have ended very differently. The experience left me shaken, but also clearer about my own limits and the respect required in the wilderness. I realized that even careful planning could fail if small details were overlooked. The forest was beautiful, silent, and dangerous, and that day I had felt the raw power of nature in a way I had never experienced before. The fear and adrenaline were still vivid in my memory, but so was the relief and gratitude for making it out alive. I knew I would never underestimate the wilderness again. I had faced real danger and survived it, and I carried that lesson with me long after I returned home. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea of leaving behind the noise of the city, the constant buzz of traffic, and the glare of screens was too tempting to resist. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of raw connection with nature that only comes when you are truly alone. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, enough food for 4 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight, spare batteries, and a compass. I had even brought a map of the area, though I had only glanced at it once. I thought I knew where I was going. The forest I had chosen was dense and remote. It wasn't a popular trail, not one where casual hikers wandered in search of Instagram-perfect scenery. The area was wild, with old trees that towered above me like guardians, moss-covered rocks, and undergrowth so thick it often scratched my legs as I pushed through. I arrived mid-morning, parking my car at a small clearing where the dirt road ended. I took a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs, and stepped out. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine. I could hear birds somewhere far above, but other than that, the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I hiked in for several hours, following a small stream that the map indicated would lead me to a suitable camping spot. The sun was high and bright, but the forest canopy shaded most of the trail, creating patterns of light and dark that shifted as I moved. I noticed the small details, the way the bark of a tree peeled away, the tiny mushrooms sprouting at its base, the wetness of the moss that grew thick along the rocks. Everything felt alive, alert. I felt a quiet thrill knowing that no one else was near. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a bend in the stream. It wasn't large, but it was flat enough to pitch my tent. I set up my camp meticulously, hammering the stakes into the ground, threading the tent poles, and making sure the rainfly was secure even though the sky was clear. I collected firewood and arranged a small pile, careful to separate dry wood from damp logs. I even created a little circle of stones to contain the fire. I felt satisfied with my preparation. This was my little kingdom in the middle of the forest. As the sun began to sink, the temperature dropped sharply. I started a small fire and boiled water for dinner. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the simple act of sitting beside a fire in the middle of nowhere. The stream gurgled gently nearby, and the wind whispered through the trees. For a moment, I felt completely at peace. Then the first sign of trouble came, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I heard a soft, rhythmic crunching in the underbrush on the other side of the clearing. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer or a fox, but the steps were too deliberate, too steady to be a small animal. I stayed still, straining my eyes in the dimming light. The sound stopped as if whoever or whatever was there had noticed me. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my imagination. Night fell quickly. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the kind of darkness that blankets the world when the forest swallows the sun completely. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the fire crackle and the stream babble. But the forest never truly sleeps. Every few minutes, I heard twigs snap, leaves rustle, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps brushing against undergrowth. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a raccoon, maybe a fox, maybe nothing at all. But the frequency of the sounds kept increasing, and the pattern of the steps seemed deliberate, circling around my campsite. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped. Absolute silence took over, the kind that makes your ears ring and your skin feel too exposed. Then came the smell, sharp, acrid, and metallic. I recognized it immediately. Smoke, but not from my fire. Something else was burning, something close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. The beam swept across the trees, across the stream, but I saw nothing unusual at first. The fire in my camp flickered, casting long shadows that danced eerily on the trees. Then I noticed it. A faint glow further down the stream, a small but persistent light. Panic rose in me. I didn't know who or what could be out there. I grabbed my knife, not because I expected to use it, but because holding something sharp made me feel less helpless. I started to quietly pack some essentials: water, food, my map, and the compass. I didn't want to run blindly into the dark, but I also didn't want to stay put. I had to make a plan. The light flickered again, closer this time. My heart pounded. I considered heading back toward the car, but the path was unclear, the forest thick with undergrowth. Every step could mean twisting an ankle or getting hopelessly lost. I stayed still, waiting, eyes straining to catch any movement. The wind shifted, and I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving with purpose toward me. Not running, not stumbling, but moving deliberately, with intent. I realized that leaving immediately was no longer optional. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and started moving along the stream, hoping it would eventually lead me to a road. Every snap of a twig behind me made my stomach clench. I didn't look back. I only kept walking, trying to be as quiet as possible while still moving quickly. The beam of the flashlight caught the occasional glimpse of eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness, distant and fleeting, always gone when I focused. Hours passed. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and my fingers were stiff from the cold. The stream eventually split into multiple smaller rivulets, and the terrain became rougher. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my palms and knees. My map was of little help in the darkness. I had only a vague sense of direction, but I knew I had to keep moving until I reached civilization. At one point, I came across a small ridge. I climbed it cautiously, hoping to get a better view. From the top, I saw a faint glow in the distance, brighter than the earlier light. I realized it was from a road or perhaps a small settlement. Relief surged through me, but I couldn't let it make me careless. I still had to reach it safely. I descended the ridge slowly, careful not to fall. The forest here was dense, the ground uneven and slippery. The moon was partially hidden by clouds, giving me just enough light to see the major obstacles but not enough to be sure where I was stepping. My body screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept me moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the edge of the forest. The trees thinned, and I found myself on a dirt road, the glow now unmistakably from a small cluster of houses. I could see lights flickering in windows, hear the distant hum of cars passing by. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted and trembling, but I was safe. I walked toward the houses, finally able to call for help if I needed it. When I reached the first one, I explained my situation to a neighbor who called the authorities to report my camping location. They confirmed later that my campsite had been disturbed. Firewood scattered, some of my supplies missing. They speculated that wild animals had been attracted to my camp at first, but the consistent movement in the underbrush and the glowing light suggested someone else had been there, perhaps another camper who had noticed me. The police assured me I had made the right decision by leaving when I did. The next morning, I returned to the forest with authorities. They scoured the area and found remnants of another camp several hundred meters away, abandoned in a hurry. The other camper had left in the dark, leaving behind signs of a struggle with nature. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and a partially collapsed tent. It seemed like the forest itself had tested us both, but we had survived because we stayed alert, careful, and persistent. The experience stayed with me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the darkness pressing in, hear the steps in the underbrush, smell the sharp, acrid smoke. But I also remembered the relief of finally breaking through the trees, seeing the distant lights of civilization, and realizing that my preparation, awareness, and determination had kept me alive. It was a brutal reminder that nature is unforgiving and isolation is dangerous, but it was also a lesson in resilience and careful planning. I never camped in that forest again, but I continued to hike and explore, always with extra caution, always respecting the unpredictability of the wild. I made detailed notes for future trips, including escape routes, emergency signals, and backup plans. I understood, more clearly than ever, that survival wasn't about luck. It was about preparation, awareness, and the willingness to keep moving forward even when fear threatened to paralyze you. That night in the forest had been terrifying, but it had also taught me that facing fear head-on, with careful action and clear thinking, could lead to a safe and victorious ending. I had been planning the trip for weeks, and everything seemed perfect on the drive out. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the narrow forest road, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. I had chosen a small, remote camping area a few hours' drive from the nearest town, one I had read about in an old hiking forum. The post spoke of serenity, quiet trails, and no crowds. That was exactly what I wanted. The thrill of being completely alone in nature, disconnected from the endless noise of phones and city life, was intoxicating. When I finally arrived, the parking area was empty except for a few scattered tire tracks. The forest beyond seemed endless, a wall of green that stretched in all directions. I unloaded my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a small backpack with essentials: flashlight, first aid kit, knife, and a portable stove. Everything fit neatly into my compact vehicle, but I felt an odd tension in the air, a sense that this place was much wilder than I had imagined from photos and descriptions online. I chose a site near a creek, the sound of running water already calming me. The ground was uneven, strewn with roots and rocks, but I found a relatively flat area large enough for my tent. Setting it up took longer than expected, my hands scraping against rough bark and sharp stones. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the forest was turning dark in a way that no city dusk could replicate. The shadows were deep and black, and the wind whispered through the trees like distant voices. I cooked a simple meal over the portable stove, the smell of rice and beans filling the air. For a moment, I felt completely at peace, the isolation that had seemed thrilling on the drive now calming and satisfying. After eating, I cleaned up, storing the food in a bear-proof container I had brought. I had read countless warnings about wildlife, and I was careful to follow every precaution. The last thing I wanted was to attract any unwelcome visitors. As night fell, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest growing louder around me. Crickets chirped constantly, owls hooted somewhere in the distance, and the creek gurgled endlessly. I felt both comforted and uneasy. It was natural, I told myself, to feel a little tension in a place this remote. But then I heard it, a faint rustling behind the tent. At first, I told myself it was probably a small animal, a raccoon, a deer, maybe a fox. But the sound continued, deliberate and soft, like someone walking carefully over twigs and leaves. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and the nearest trail was supposed to be miles away. I stayed still, straining my ears, trying to determine if it was moving away or closer. The rustling seemed to circle the tent slowly, methodically. My heartbeat quickened, and I realized my flashlight was inside the tent, beyond my immediate reach. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Whoever or whatever was out there would eventually move on, right? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, I thought it had gone. I relaxed slightly, enough to reach for my flashlight. The moment I turned it on, a beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the empty forest floor. My pulse remained high, though, and I sat upright in my sleeping bag, listening. Then a soft snap, another twig, closer this time. My stomach dropped, I grabbed my knife, small but sharp, and unzipped the tent partially. Peering out, I saw movement near a cluster of trees a few meters away. Someone was there. I could just make out the shape of a person crouched low, moving with caution, as if they were trying not to be seen. My hands shook, my mind racing. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. There was no cell signal. If this person intended harm, I was alone. Completely alone. I remembered the whistle in my backpack, a simple safety precaution. I took it out and blew as hard as I could. The sound pierced the night, sharp and loud. For a moment, the figure froze, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait to see where. My instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave immediately. I hurriedly collected my essentials, leaving the tent behind. Every rustle, every shadow, every movement set my nerves on edge. I kept my flashlight on, scanning the dense forest for any sign of the person. The path to the car felt much longer than it had that afternoon. My heart thumped so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The trees seemed endless, dark trunks rising like silent sentinels. Somewhere along the way, I slipped on a wet patch of moss, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my side, but I forced myself up. There was no time to assess the injury properly. I forced myself to keep moving, listening for any footsteps behind me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. My flashlight flickered once, and panic gripped me. I tapped it, shaken, and it steadied. I reminded myself to stay calm, to focus on one step at a time. Hours passed, or maybe it was only 30 minutes, I couldn't tell. Eventually, the path opened into the small clearing where I had parked. Relief washed over me, though I remained cautious, scanning the trees as I reached my car. The door locked with a satisfying click, and I sat there for a long moment, trying to calm my shaking hands. I realized I had been holding my breath for who knew how long. I debated driving back immediately, but the road was narrow and winding, and it was pitch dark. I decided to wait, thinking it safer to let the night pass before attempting the drive. I stayed in the car, lights on, engine running, listening to the forest around me. Every sound made me flinch. An owl hooting, the creek running, leaves rustling in the wind. But there were no more signs of anyone near the clearing. By dawn, the tension in my body had eased slightly, though I remained alert. I decided to drive back slowly, scanning the trees as I went. The road wound through thick forest for miles, and I never saw another person. Once I reached a small town, I pulled over at a diner for breakfast, trying to process everything. My hands were still trembling, and my stomach churned with adrenaline, but I felt a sense of triumph as well. I had survived. I had been careful, cautious, and quick thinking, and it had made the difference. Looking back, I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. If I hadn't had the whistle, or if I had hesitated, or if the figure had been closer than I thought, the outcome might have been very different. I made mental notes. Always tell someone exactly where I'm going. Never camp alone in remote areas without backup. Always trust instincts. Nature is unpredictable, yes, but people can be unpredictable too, and that unpredictability is far scarier. The lessons stayed with me long after that trip. I went camping again later, but never alone. I made sure to check in regularly, to avoid secluded areas without cell coverage, and to carry multiple safety tools. I still enjoy the forest, the peace, the escape from the city, but there's always an awareness now, a subtle tension beneath the calm, that keeps me alert. I learned that fear isn't always about what you see. It's about what you can't see, what you don't control, and how you respond when faced with it. The trip had been terrifying, yes, but it had also taught me resilience. I had faced a real threat, alone in an unfamiliar environment, and I had come through intact. It gave me confidence, a quiet knowledge that I could handle extreme situations, that careful preparation and calm thinking mattered. Most importantly, it reminded me that the wilderness can be beautiful and serene, but it demands respect, and that includes respecting the unpredictability of other people. From that day onward, my camping trips were no longer just about solitude and adventure. They were about preparation, awareness, and survival. I learned to carry extra supplies, always have an exit plan, and to trust my instincts without hesitation. I also learned to appreciate the small comforts, the warmth of a fire, the sound of water running, the soft moss underfoot, because they could provide not just beauty, but a grounding reassurance in moments of fear. Even now, I can recall the night vividly, the rustling around the tent, the fear, the adrenaline, but it doesn't feel paralyzing anymore. It feels like a reminder of how careful planning, quick thinking, and respect for the unknown can make the difference between disaster and safety. That night taught me more than any guidebook ever could, and though I never want to relive it, I carry the lessons with me every time I step into the forest. Camping will always be an escape for me, a place of peace and reflection, but now it is tempered with awareness and respect. I understand the wilderness better, and I understand human unpredictability even more. And while fear is natural, it can be controlled with preparation and vigilance. The night was terrifying, yes, but in the end, I emerged stronger, wiser, and with a renewed sense of what it means to survive, fully alert and fully alive. I had planned this camping trip for months. It wasn't complicated. Just me, my backpack, and a small tent in a remote part of the forest I had never visited before. I had been camping plenty of times, and I had done all the usual preparation: food, water, a sleeping bag, matches, a first aid kit, and a reliable headlamp with extra batteries. I knew the forest wasn't famous for bears or other predators, but it was large and rugged enough that if I got hurt or lost, it could turn serious fast. I arrived in the late afternoon. The forest road was narrow, overgrown, and covered with small stones that rattled under the wheels of my old sedan. I had parked where a small clearing opened up beside a creek that ran quietly through the trees. The sun was low, sending long streaks of gold across the water. The creek looked peaceful at first, and I thought it would be a perfect place to set up camp, maybe even fish a little before night fell. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear, carefully checking my supplies. I set up my tent about 30 feet from the creek, on a slightly raised area to avoid any overnight dampness. I cleared some leaves and rocks, hammered the stakes into the soil, and rolled out my sleeping bag inside. I left the backpack open for easy access and laid out my small stove, some dry wood I had collected earlier, and a bag of instant noodles. By the time I finished, the sun was low on the horizon, the trees casting dark shadows across the ground. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Usually at this hour, birds would call to each other, squirrels would be rustling in the undergrowth, but it felt like the forest had been muted, as if it was holding its breath. I brushed it off as normal, convincing myself that it was just the calm before nightfall. I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The flames licked upward, cracking wood and sending occasional sparks into the cool air. I had just poured hot water over my noodles when I heard the first sound. At first, it was faint, almost like a branch snapping under weight. I paused and listened. Silence. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal moving quietly in the underbrush. I ate quickly, feeling a little tension in my shoulders I couldn't quite shake. As the light faded, the forest darkened more quickly than I expected. My headlamp was ready, but I preferred to save the battery for later. I cleaned my small cooking area, put the food away in the bear-proof container I had brought, and went to lie down in the tent. The air had grown colder, the kind of damp cold that creeps into your bones. I had just zipped the tent closed when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a snap or a rustle. It was a deliberate crunch, like someone walking carefully over dry leaves. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the sound might have been an animal, maybe even a raccoon rummaging somewhere nearby. Still, I kept the zipper halfway open to peek out. I saw nothing. The flashlight beam from my headlamp cut only a small circle through the blackness. The forest beyond was impenetrable, a wall of dark shapes. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal, and I had deliberately left it off to avoid draining the battery. I tried to calm myself, telling myself this was just part of camping alone. Strange noises, shadows, and your mind playing tricks. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again. This time, the steps were heavier and closer, coming from the path that led down to my campsite. My heart began to race. I considered leaving immediately, but I had parked the car a good 10-minute walk back along the dark trail, and without my flashlight, I couldn't see well enough to make it there safely. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my camping knife, a small but sharp blade, and held it ready. I stayed in the tent, straining to hear, trying not to make a sound. The steps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. I froze. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be moving around my camp, not passing by but intentionally circling. Then the snapping started again. A branch bent low under weight and then straightened with a sharp crack. The steps were closer now, so close that I felt them pressing through the thin fabric of the tent. My mind raced with possibilities, all bad. Could it be a lost hiker? Someone who had gotten drunk or hurt? Or worse, someone with intent? I had no idea, and that uncertainty was almost worse than the thought itself. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Eventually, the sounds moved away. I heard the footsteps recede, the crunch of leaves fading. I didn't move, I didn't breathe loudly, I just waited. Eventually, I convinced myself it was safe enough to get up and check the perimeter. I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully. The forest was dark, silent again, the fire reduced to red embers. I scanned the area, shining my headlamp in wide sweeps. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here, except for one small detail. The back flap of my tent was open. I was sure I had zipped it closed. Panic hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been inside my tent. I checked my bag, my supplies. Everything seemed untouched. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything, but that didn't make it less terrifying. They had been here, they had seen me, and now they were gone. Or at least they were hiding somewhere close, waiting. I decided not to stay. I packed up quickly, tossing the tent into its bag, grabbing my backpack, stove, and sleeping bag. The fire I left smoldering, small enough that it wouldn't draw attention, but enough that it looked undisturbed from a distance. I moved quietly, sticking to the trees for cover as I walked back toward the car. Every sound, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, to keep moving, and to not make mistakes. About halfway to the car, I saw movement in the shadows. I froze, trying to identify it. It was human-shaped, crouched low, moving slowly between the trees. I ducked behind a thick oak, my breath shallow. The figure paused, then moved in a direction parallel to mine. Whoever it was had a flashlight, but it was small, weak, almost like they didn't want to reveal themselves. I kept my distance, careful not to be seen. I finally reached the edge of the forest where my car was parked. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, engine off, listening. The forest was quiet again, but I didn't move until the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the trees. When I finally drove out, I didn't look back. I told myself later that it was probably someone camping or hiking in the forest, someone who didn't expect to see me and panicked, maybe even someone who liked to wander at night. But the memory of the footsteps around my tent, the feeling of being watched, and the small detail of my tent flap being open would stay with me for a long time. After that trip, I never camped alone in a forest I didn't know. I stuck to well-traveled sites, places with rangers or other campers around. I invested in better locks, motion sensor lights, and even a small personal alarm. The experience had been terrifying, but it had taught me something essential. Nature itself isn't always dangerous, but people can be, and in a place where no one is around to help, even a single encounter can turn deadly. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. Every instinct that told me something was wrong was correct. Staying calm, assessing the situation, and moving quietly was what kept me safe. I can still feel the damp cold of that night, the darkness pressing around the trees, and the sound of footsteps circling me. I know now that the forest holds many dangers, not the kind you read about in stories, but real, human dangers that leave no trace, no explanation, just the lingering fear that someone was there, watching, deciding what to do next. I never returned to that clearing, and I still avoid camping alone in remote forests. But I don't regret the experience. It changed the way I approach survival, the way I trust my senses, and the way I respect the quiet that hides so much more than just trees and animals. That night in the forest became a lesson I carry with me, a warning and a reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that are completely real and completely unexplainable, leaving you with nothing but your own awareness and the thin line between safety and danger. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed to escape everything: work, the constant noise of the city, the endless obligations that made my life feel like a cage. I packed my backpack carefully the night before, making sure I had everything: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, extra food, a first aid kit, headlamp, and my trusty multi-tool. I had also brought my phone, fully charged, and a power bank. I felt prepared. I left early in the morning, when the streets were still quiet, the air crisp with the first chill of autumn. My destination was a small, remote area in a national forest I had never visited before. The map said there was a small creek, a few meadows, and some hiking trails, but it wasn't heavily trafficked. That was exactly what I wanted: solitude. The drive was long, winding through mountain roads, past dense forests, and finally, after several hours, I parked near a trailhead. The place was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. I started my hike carrying my full backpack. The trail was narrow and uneven, covered in fallen leaves that made my steps soft and careful. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed how much darker it felt under the thick canopy. The sun reached the forest floor in scattered patches, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist with the movement of the trees. I told myself it was just the forest, nothing more, but a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. About 2 hours in, I found a clearing near the edge of a small creek. The spot was perfect for camping. Flat ground, enough open space for my tent, and a steady source of water. I set up my tent carefully, checking the stakes twice to make sure it wouldn't collapse during the night. The sound of the creek was soothing, and I filled my water bottle, using the filter to ensure it was safe to drink. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the forest started to change. Shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped quickly. I made a small fire, just enough to keep warm while I cooked dinner. I was alone, and the solitude was comforting at first. The crackle of the fire, the smell of wet leaves, and the steady burble of the creek created a strange, quiet rhythm that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in months. I ate slowly, savoring the food and the calm, watching as the sunlight faded and the forest went completely dark. Night in the forest was different from anything I had experienced in a city. The darkness was heavy, almost tactile, pressing in around me. I could hear small noises everywhere: twigs snapping under the weight of something unseen, leaves rustling, the distant scream of an animal. I told myself these were deer or maybe raccoons or the wind, but my mind began to imagine other possibilities. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the fire, on the warmth, on the soft murmur of the creek. I slept lightly, waking several times during the night. Every sound made me tense, my heart racing, my body ready to jump up and investigate. I had brought earplugs, but I didn't use them. I needed to stay aware, I told myself. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving past my tent, but when I blinked, it was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the firelight, or perhaps the wind shifting a branch. Still, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edge of my consciousness. The next morning, I decided to go for a short hike to explore. I didn't want to stay camped all day. I wanted to see more of the forest, to remind myself why I came. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and my phone, leaving the larger pack at the campsite. The forest felt different in the morning light. The shadows were less oppressive, the air warmer, filled with the sounds of birds and insects. I followed a trail that ran parallel to the creek, enjoying the sense of space, of being completely alone in a place so wild. After about an hour, I came to a section of the trail that was overgrown. The brush was thick, and the ground uneven, but I pressed on, curious to see where it led. That was when I heard the first real sign that something was wrong. A loud, heavy crunch of leaves behind me. I froze. My heart began to pound, my ears straining to hear more. Another crunch, slower this time, deliberate. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear, maybe someone else hiking. But the sound had a rhythm, a weight, a pace that didn't feel natural for any animal I knew. I decided it was time to head back to camp. The sense of unease had grown into a pressing anxiety, a knot in my stomach that tightened with every step. As I walked back, the noise behind me seemed to grow louder, following me with almost perfect timing. My steps quickened, my breathing came faster. When I reached the creek, I paused, trying to gather my bearings. The sun was high, the forest bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. I picked up a large stick from the ground, holding it ready as I continued toward camp. When I arrived, the campsite looked the same at first. My tent, my fire pit, my gear, it all appeared untouched. But then I noticed something subtle. The leaves around the tent were disturbed, as if someone had brushed against them. I felt my stomach drop. I checked my tent, opening it slowly. Inside, nothing was out of place, but my sense of security was gone. The forest that had felt peaceful now felt hostile, the shadows longer and heavier. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up quickly, not caring about order or organization, just wanting to get back to my car and out of the forest. As I slung my backpack on, I heard it again, that deliberate, heavy crunch behind me. I froze, scanning the forest, but still saw nothing. My hands shook as I picked up my hiking poles. I started walking toward the trailhead, faster now, my steps almost running. The noise followed me, keeping pace, echoing in the stillness of the forest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away. I ignored the soreness in my legs, the sweat on my forehead, the fatigue in my shoulders. Couldn't let myself be caught. I didn't know who or what was behind me, and I didn't want to find out. By the time I reached the main trail, I could see the edge of the forest, where my car was parked. Relief washed over me, but the sense of danger lingered. I kept my eyes on the trees, listening for any sound. The forest seemed quiet again, almost as if nothing had followed me, but I didn't trust it. I broke into a jog, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I unlocked the doors, threw my pack in the back seat, and jumped into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I kept my eyes on the forest as I pulled away, half expecting to see something or someone emerging from the trees. But the forest remained silent, its shadows deep and empty. The drive back was tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, watching the edges of the forest as they slipped away. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker, someone with bad intentions, maybe even a hunter who hadn't expected to see me. Whatever it was, I was grateful I had trusted my instincts and left when I did. When I finally reached the highway, the lights of the cars and the sound of engines felt like a sanctuary. I pulled into the first rest stop, shaking, and poured myself a bottle of water. I sat for a long time, letting my heartbeat slow and trying to process everything. The forest had felt safe at first, inviting even, but it had changed in a matter of hours. It had reminded me that even in nature, alone, you can't control everything, and sometimes danger hides in the ordinary. That night, back in my apartment, I unpacked my gear slowly. I examined every piece carefully, looking for signs of tampering or disturbance. Nothing. The forest had left no trace of whatever had followed me, only the memory of the fear, the weight of it pressing against me as I lay in my own bed. I realized that sometimes the scariest experiences aren't about monsters or ghosts. They're about the very real unpredictability of the world around you, and the raw, physical fear of knowing you are vulnerable, alone, and being watched without knowing why. Since that trip, I've been back to camping, but always in well-traveled areas, always with others. I've hiked countless trails, slept in countless forests, but I have never again felt the same sense of absolute solitude that night. And I know now that fear can be just as sharp, just as real, as anything you can imagine. It is not the shadow that kills you, but the knowledge that something might be hiding in it, waiting, just out of sight. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the endless hum of traffic, and the pressure of work. I needed silence, solitude, and the rawness of nature. I packed carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a first aid kit, food, water, a small stove, and a flashlight with spare batteries. I even packed a map and a compass, though I knew I could use my phone for GPS if needed. I left early in the morning, hoping to reach the campsite by noon. The drive itself was long, winding through hills, dense forests, and stretches of road where sunlight barely broke through the canopy. When I arrived at the site, it was more isolated than I had imagined. There were no other campers visible, no voices or laughter echoing through the trees, only the sound of the wind through the leaves and the occasional cry of a bird. The campsite was a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees, their needles carpeting the ground. A narrow stream ran along the edge, water clear but fast, gurgling over rocks and fallen branches. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing, far enough to keep the smell of the vehicle away from the campsite, and began to set up my tent. The tent itself was small, a two-person model, though I was alone. I pegged it down carefully, making sure it was stable. I spread out my sleeping bag, organized my gear, and collected some firewood from the surrounding area. I wanted a fire not just for warmth and cooking but for a sense of security. There is something primal about a fire in the wilderness, a circle of light that pushes back the dark unknown beyond it. By the time the fire was going, the sun was starting to lower in the sky. The forest shifted colors, shadows lengthening, the air cooling rapidly. I cooked some rice and beans on my small stove, the smell of it filling the clearing. I ate slowly, listening to the forest settle into evening. At first, everything was calm. The birds were quieting, insects buzzing more actively as the sun disappeared. The stream's murmur was soothing, hypnotic even. But as darkness fully fell, I started to notice other sounds, subtle, irregular, and low. A snap of a twig, a rustle in the brush, the soft crunch of leaves that didn't match the wind. My skin prickled. I reminded myself that I was in the forest. Animals lived here. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote or two. It was normal for wildlife to move around at night. Still, there was something different this evening. I had camped before in other forests, and I had never felt this kind of tension. I checked my flashlight and batteries. I kept my small folding knife within reach. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, curling up in my sleeping bag, but the noises didn't stop. The forest was alive with sound. Occasionally, I thought I heard something larger, something heavier than a raccoon or deer. My heart would skip and I would strain to listen. The firelight flickered, shadows dancing on the trees, making branches look like arms reaching out. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. I wasn't alone in the city, scared of nothing. I was trained to be aware, alert, and careful. Around midnight, I noticed it. A smell, faint but unmistakable. The sharp, acrid scent of smoke, but not my fire. My heart thumped in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. I strained my ears. The snapping of small branches had stopped, but now there was a low murmur of movement, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. It wasn't wind. It wasn't animal. It sounded human. I froze. The logical part of my brain reminded me that it could be another camper, maybe someone walking their dog, maybe lost themselves. But I had seen no other signs of life when I arrived. The forest was empty. My gut told me something else, something that made my throat tight and my hands sweat. I grabbed my map and compass, planning mentally how I could get to the car quickly if needed. I turned the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the firelight. The movement was closer now, the faint sound of crunching leaves under heavy boots. My mind raced. If it was another camper, They would have called out by now, asking for directions or a fire. This was deliberate, slow, careful, observing, waiting. I debated my options. I could stay in the tent, barricade myself with the knife and fire, and wait until morning. Or I could take my chances and get to the car, the only real escape I had. The forest around me was thick, trees close together, undergrowth sharp, and the ground uneven. Moving quietly would be difficult. I decided to move. Slowly, deliberately, I grabbed my flashlight and slid out of the tent. The fire had dimmed to embers, but I didn't dare rekindle it. I crouched low, moving toward the car, careful to place each footstep softly on the pine needles and soil. My breathing was slow, controlled. I tried not to make noise, but every step felt like it echoed. Then I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees, tall, broad, cautious. I froze. It had to be the source of the sounds. I could see the faint outline of a figure, moving slowly, scanning the area, as if aware that I was awake. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I ducked behind a tree, flashlight off, waiting. The figure paused, head turning in my direction, and then moved on, disappearing between the trees. I took a deep breath. I was far enough from the fire that the embers couldn't reveal me. I continued toward the car, each step carefully measured, avoiding twigs and branches. The figure had stopped moving. Couldn't see it, but I felt it. The sense of being watched, followed, was overwhelming. I moved faster, though still cautious. Finally, I reached the edge of the clearing where my car was parked. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the forest, empty again. I kept the car running, sat for a long time, listening. Every small noise made me tense, but nothing else came. I realized then that the figure might have been observing me for hours, waiting, testing, deciding what to do. Morning came slowly. Exhausted, I slept for a few hours in the car. When I woke, sunlight filtered through the trees. I stepped outside carefully, looking around. The clearing was empty, no sign of the person from the night. Only my fire pit, the stream, and the natural world continued as if nothing had happened. I packed my gear quickly, keeping alert. I drove out of the forest without taking my usual scenic detours, keeping to the main road. When I finally reached a small town, I stopped at a diner, shook, and drank coffee, trying to calm my nerves. I filed a report with the local ranger station, describing what had happened and where. They took it seriously, noting that the area had seen reports of trespassers and occasional break-ins near campsites. I realized then that it wasn't wildlife or imagination. It was someone, a human, potentially dangerous, who had been lurking, watching campers. I never returned to that campsite. I told a few close friends what had happened, warning them to be careful and prepared when camping in isolated areas. I kept the knife and flashlight I had used that night in my car for emergencies. Over time, the fear subsided, replaced by caution and awareness. I learned to respect the forest not just for its beauty but for its solitude, where danger can hide in shadows, silent and patient. That experience changed the way I approached camping forever. I no longer treated isolation lightly. I always camped with a friend, kept escape routes planned, and stayed vigilant, understanding that the quiet of the wilderness can hide very real threats. The forest itself is neutral, but humans, unpredictable and patient, can make even the most peaceful setting feel terrifying. I can remember every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat from that night. The memory is clear, burned into me like a warning. But I also remember the relief of morning, the clarity that I had survived because of preparation, awareness, and patience. I left the forest alive, cautious, and wiser. The fear taught me something essential. Respect the wilderness, respect yourself, and never underestimate the hidden dangers that can appear when you least expect them. I decided to go camping alone that weekend because I needed to get away from people for a while. Everything in my life had started to feel heavy. Work, city noise, traffic, screens, messages, the constant sense that my mind never shut off. I had always liked the quiet of the woods, the slow rhythm of nature, and the kind of silence that felt clean. I picked a forest I had visited years ago, a large area of public land a few hours from town, full of long trails and back roads that most people didn't bother with. It wasn't a tourist spot. It was the kind of place where you could hike for hours without seeing anyone. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but calm, two-lane roads stretching through empty fields, then curving into tree-covered hills. The farther I went, the more isolated it became. By the time I turned off the main road, my phone had already lost signal. The dirt road leading into the forest was rough and narrow, just wide enough for my small SUV to crawl through. Branches brushed against the windows. The sound of gravel under the tires filled the air, mixed with the wind through leaves. I felt that deep quiet start to settle in, the kind that only happens far from everything man-made. I parked in a small clearing beside an unmarked trail that I remembered from years before. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was level ground with enough open space to set up a tent. The air smelled clean, earthy, with a faint scent of pine and wet soil. I unpacked slowly, stretching my legs after the drive. The forest around me was thick, tall trees rising close together, their tops tangled with each other, sunlight slipping through in narrow beams. I could hear the distant sound of running water, maybe a stream or small river somewhere downhill. I set up my small two-person tent, rolled out the sleeping bag, gathered wood for a fire. Everything felt calm. The only movement came from the wind moving through the branches and the occasional bird gliding between trees. I spent most of the afternoon walking around the area, trying to get familiar with my surroundings. The forest floor was soft and damp, covered in layers of needles and leaves. There were faint animal tracks near the stream and small piles of scat that looked like deer. It was all normal. When evening came, I built a fire. The crackling sound filled the clearing. I cooked a simple meal on my small camping stove, canned soup, bread, and coffee. As the sun dropped, the woods darkened fast. The air cooled sharply, and by the time night fully settled, the forest was completely black beyond the reach of the fire. I sat there for a long time, just watching the flames move and listening to the faint hum of insects. The silence was so deep that every small sound, the pop of a log, a leaf dropping, a twig snapping, stood out clearly. Sometime after midnight, I decided to sleep. I zipped up the tent, crawled into the bag, and lay still, listening to the wind outside. For a long time, I didn't hear anything unusual. But then, just as I was drifting towards sleep, I heard something faint, a sound that didn't fit. It was like a footstep, not the random crunch of a branch falling, but the slow, deliberate sound of something pressing into the ground. I held my breath and listened. The forest was still again. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, something moving nearby. I forced myself to relax. It took a while, but I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was cold and damp, and everything was covered in a thin mist. I boiled water for coffee, ate a protein bar, and walked down to the stream I had heard the night before. It was maybe 200 yards from camp, hidden behind thick brush. The water was clear and shallow, running fast over smooth stones. I filled my bottle and looked around. I didn't see any signs of other people, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It felt completely empty. I spent most of that day hiking farther into the woods. I followed game trails that twisted through dense undergrowth and climbed up rocky slopes. The forest stretched endlessly. Occasionally I found old fire rings, just blackened circles of stones, maybe left by hunters long ago, but none looked recent. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. When I came back to camp in the late afternoon, everything was just as I left it, except for one thing. The small pile of firewood I had stacked beside the tent had shifted. Some of the pieces were scattered. It looked like maybe an animal had moved through, but there were no claw marks, no signs of digging or chewing. It just looked disturbed, like someone had nudged it with their foot. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe it had been the wind or something small climbing on it. Still, I felt a small knot of unease settle in my chest. That night, I made another fire and ate dinner. The forest felt heavier, quieter in a strange way. The air was completely still, no breeze, no sound from the trees. Even the insects seemed less active. I sat close to the fire, feeling that sense of being watched that sometimes comes when you're alone too long. The darkness around the clearing seemed thicker than before. As I was cleaning up, I noticed something at the edge of the light, a faint shape between two trees, maybe 40 feet away. It was hard to tell what it was because of the shadows, but it looked like a darker spot in the darkness, almost like the outline of a person standing still. My eyes kept trying to adjust, but the light from the fire made it impossible to focus clearly beyond the circle of light. I stared for a long time. The shape didn't move. Then I blinked and it was gone, or maybe it had just been a trick of the firelight and the way shadows shifted. Still, it left me uneasy. I barely slept that night. I kept waking up, listening to the forest. Once, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps again, slow and careful, moving somewhere beyond the tent. I lay completely still, heart pounding, holding my breath. The steps stopped after a few moments, and then everything was silent. I stayed awake for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I stepped out of the tent at sunrise, the first thing I noticed was that there were footprints on the ground near the ashes of the fire. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, deeper. The pattern looked like the bottom of heavy boots. They led from the edge of the clearing to the fire pit and then disappeared into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. My first thought was that maybe a hunter or hiker had passed through during the night, but that made no sense. Who walks through someone's camp in the dark without saying anything? I checked my gear. Everything was still there. The tent, my bag, the food, nothing was missing. But that didn't make me feel better. Whoever it was hadn't come to steal. They had just come close. That was worse. I considered packing up and leaving, but something stubborn in me resisted. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was overreacting. So I stayed. I decided to move the tent a bit deeper into the woods, closer to the stream, where it would be hidden better from the trail. It took me an hour to break camp and set it up again. I kept checking my surroundings, listening for sounds. The woods were completely still, but that stillness felt wrong now. Not peaceful, but expectant. That afternoon, I gathered more firewood and explored a bit farther downstream. I found an old, half-collapsed wooden bridge covered in moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I spent some time there, sitting by the water, trying to shake the tension building in my chest. But when I came back toward camp near sunset, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were new footprints again. This time, they were fresher. They led toward my tent. The prints looked exactly like the ones from that morning, the same deep tread marks. I followed them slowly, heart pounding. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent, then turned and went back the way they came. Whoever it was had come close again, maybe while I was by the bridge. The realization made my stomach twist. They had been watching me again when I wasn't there. That night, I couldn't bring myself to light a fire. The glow would only make me visible. Instead, I sat inside the tent with my headlamp turned off, just listening. Hours passed in total darkness. My ears strained for every sound. The rustle of leaves, the creak of trees. Around midnight, I heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps again. They were slow, careful, moving around the edge of the tent. The sound of weight pressing into the ground. Then silence. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. I stayed absolutely still. A minute passed. Then I heard the faint sound of breathing. Not mine, but close, just outside the thin fabric of the tent. It lasted only a few seconds before fading away. I didn't move until dawn. When light finally came, I stepped outside. My legs were shaking. There were more footprints all around the tent in a circle. Whoever it was had walked slowly around me while I lay inside. I decided I had to leave. I packed as fast as I could. But when I reached the dirt road where my SUV was parked, I stopped dead again. There were more prints, the same kind, all around the vehicle. Someone had been there too. My driver's side door handle had a faint smear of mud on it, like it had been tried. The car was locked, but the sight made my stomach drop. I started the engine and drove out fast, tires spinning on the gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel steady. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but there was no one, just the empty forest shrinking behind me. When I finally got back to town that afternoon, I parked in front of my apartment and sat there for a long time, just staring ahead. Everything looked normal, cars passing, people walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, deep in those woods, someone was still standing between the trees, watching, waiting for whoever might come next. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I went online and looked up reports about that forest area. Buried in local forums and old posts, I found a few mentions, people saying they'd felt watched while camping there, some claiming they'd found their camps disturbed or heard footsteps at night. One post described an old hermit or hunter who supposedly lived out there, someone who didn't like outsiders. There was no proof, no official reports, just stories that trailed off without answers. I never went back. Even now, when I think about it, what scares me most isn't the footprints or the sounds. It's the thought that whoever it was, they never wanted to harm me. They just wanted to watch. They were close enough to touch the tent, close enough to breathe behind the thin layer of fabric while I pretended to sleep, and I never saw their face. Somewhere in those woods, a person who moves silently, who waits for the dark, is still out there, and the forest keeps its silence. I had been waiting for this camping trip for weeks. My life had been too loud lately. City noise, constant phone notifications, and people everywhere. I needed quiet, and I wanted to be far away from everything. I picked a place called Raven Ridge Forest, a long stretch of wilderness about 4 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly why I chose it. I planned to stay for 3 nights. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, extra water, food for 3 days, and my old camera. I had everything carefully stored in my backpack and a small cooler. I left early in the morning so I could set up camp before dark. The drive was calm at first. The paved road turned to dirt after a while, then narrowed into a rough single-lane track that wound between thick pines. My car's tires kicked up dust behind me. There was no signal on my phone. For the first time in a while, I felt completely cut off from everything. It was a strange kind of peace. After about an hour on the dirt road, I found a spot that looked perfect. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small clearing with flat ground beside a stream. There were old fire rings nearby, which meant others had camped there before. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. The sound of the running water made the place feel even more peaceful. I parked the car beside a fallen tree and unpacked everything. Setting up camp always took a while, especially when I wanted everything neat. I pitched my tent close to the tree line, a few yards from the stream. I laid my sleeping bag inside, arranged my cooler just outside, and built a small fire ring using old stones that were already there. The first day went smoothly. I collected some dry wood, filtered water from the stream, and cooked a simple meal. The forest was full of soft sounds: birds, wind, the water running over rocks. When evening came, the air turned colder, and a thin mist drifted in from the stream. The firelight flickered against the trees, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the silence. It was almost too quiet, but I reminded myself that's why I came. For quiet. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and lay still listening to the sound of the stream. It was peaceful until I heard something faint, like a twig snapping somewhere behind the tent. I told myself it was probably just an animal, raccoon maybe, or a deer. It was common. I closed my eyes again, but my mind wouldn't let go of it. Every small noise felt amplified. The creak of trees, the shuffle of leaves, even the low hum of the fire dying outside. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the world outside was covered in a thin gray fog. The stream looked like a white ribbon twisting through the forest. My fire pit had gone cold. I boiled some water for coffee and sat on a rock watching the fog lift. That's when I noticed something odd. footprints in the damp soil near the edge of my campsite. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and came from the direction of the trees behind my tent. The prints stopped near the fire pit and then turned back toward the woods. I crouched down, staring at them. The tread marks were deep enough to show boot patterns. Not animal tracks, human. It made my chest tighten a little, but I told myself it could have been someone passing through. Maybe a hunter or another camper. Still, it didn't sit right with me that they came so close to my tent. Whoever it was had to walk through my camp while I slept. I spent most of the day exploring the area anyway. I followed the stream for a while, took some photos, and collected firewood on my way back. By the time I returned, the sun was already low. When I came back, I noticed something else strange. My cooler lid was open. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't closed it properly, but some of the food wrappers were torn. A protein bar was missing, and a bag of chips was half empty. I looked for animal tracks, but again, boot prints. Someone had opened it. I checked my car. The doors were still locked. Everything inside was untouched, but that cooler was definitely messed with. The fire ring stones had been shifted slightly, too, like someone had nudged them. That night, I decided to keep the fire burning longer. The forest felt different. Still quiet, but not peaceful anymore. Every rustle in the trees made my muscles tense. When I finally went to bed, I left my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep well. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again to the same sound, footsteps. Slow, careful ones. They stopped and started. Sometimes they crunched over leaves, sometimes they went completely silent, like whoever it was standing still, listening. I held my breath and didn't move. The tent felt smaller than ever. My heart was beating so loud I was sure they could hear it from outside. Then I saw it, the faint shadow of movement on the tent wall. The fire outside had burned low, but the light was enough to outline shapes. The figure was tall, standing still just a few feet away. I waited. The shadow didn't move for almost a full minute. Then, slowly, it backed away into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, frozen in that sleeping bag, gripping the flashlight the entire time. When daylight finally came, I crawled out and looked around. There were fresh boot prints again, newer, clearer. They went around the tent and stopped behind the trees. Then they vanished into the woods. At that point, I wanted to leave. I started packing, but I stopped halfway. Part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. I had driven hours to get here, and maybe it was nothing more than a hiker passing through. So I stayed. One more night, I told myself. I spent the day uneasy, scanning the trees often. The woods didn't look peaceful anymore. I noticed small things. Bits of broken bark, cigarette butts, and what looked like an old tarp edge half buried in the dirt about 50 feet from my camp. When I checked it, I found the remains of an old campsite. A few rusted cans, burnt wood, and a piece of rope tied around a branch. The ground there was flat and dark, like it had been used many times before. That discovery made me feel worse. It looked like someone used to stay there. When darkness came again, I set up a small fire but kept it dim. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate quickly and sat still listening. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me. The sound of a camera shutter. It was faint, but I knew that sound too well. I had my own camera, and I knew what it sounded like when the shutter clicked in the quiet. I turned off my flashlight and listened harder. Came again. A soft mechanical click. From the woods behind my tent. Someone was out there, taking pictures. My throat felt dry. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. The sound stopped eventually, but the forest stayed alive with soft cracks and rustles. The first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I shoved my sleeping bag and tent into the trunk. Didn't even care how messy it looked. I was done. When I got into the car, I looked toward the treeline one last time, and that's when I saw something glinting between two trees. I walked a few steps closer and saw what it was. It was a small trail camera, the kind hunters use, strapped to a tree and pointed directly at my campsite. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it. There was a wire running down from it, half buried in the dirt. It had been there for a while. That's when it all made sense. The footsteps, the missing food, the pictures. Someone had been camping out there, maybe living there, and they had been watching me from the moment I arrived. I got in my car and drove. The road felt narrower than before, every turn sharp and blind. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station miles away. When I finally got phone signal, I called the local sheriff's office and told them what I'd found. The tracks, the food theft, the camera pointed at my camp. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I gave them the coordinates from my GPS. A few days later, I got a call back. They said they found the site, and yes, there was a hidden camp deeper in the woods, a tarp shelter, food wrappers, and several trail cameras tied to trees. Some of them were still active. Whoever had set them up was gone. They didn't find any ID, no sign of who it was, but one of the memory cards had recent pictures. Some of deer, some of campers. A few were of me, sitting by my fire, sleeping in my tent, and walking to the stream. That was the part that stayed with me, knowing someone had been close enough to watch me like that, take those photos without me knowing. I haven't gone camping alone since. Now, whenever I pass by a patch of woods or hear a branch snap somewhere in the distance, that same cold feeling hits the back of my neck. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Because somewhere out there, in a place where there's no cell service and only silence, someone could be standing between the trees, waiting, watching, and taking pictures of whoever decides to spend the night alone. And that thought is enough to make the woods feel like the scariest place in the world.